I want to talk a little bit about cause and effect, which is a concept that doesn't feature nearly often enough in our intellectual intercourse these days. You may have heard yesterday's news about inflation hitting 7.5%, which is a 40-year high for those fans who are keeping score at home. And just like clockwork, everybody in the government, everybody in the fake news media, they all throw up their hands like a bunch of dumbasses and fumble around for the answer. Golly gee whiz! Now, why do you suppose this runaway inflation is happening? Get me an expert economist on the phone, pronto! Or, alternately, here's a different idea. How about pulling your head out from inside your ass and looking at the basic facts that are in front of you, specifically? The facts that say, well, over the course of these last 18 months, we've blasted about $4.5 trillion of fake money into the economy under the guise of something called COVID stimulus. It was really all for crack pipes, but hey, these things happen. While at the same time, the national government, all state governments run by Democrats, some state governments run by Republicans, they stood by with their collective boot heel on the throat of the American worker and the American entrepreneur, tossing people off their jobs right and left over stupid vaccine mandates, crushing small businesses with arbitrary, capricious new regulations, making everyone live in a world populated by faithless zombies and secular burkas, and perpetrating one of the most ghastly acts of mass child abuse in recorded history with the needless school closures and the unconscionable mask requirements. So, do you think any of that might have had a deleterious effect on the economy? Do you think any of that might be a driver behind an inflation rate that's so high we should probably all start brushing up on our Weimar Republic jokes? Honey, will you go to the store and get me a loaf of bread? Of course, dear. Where did I leave the wheelbarrow? But this is how you can tell when you're dealing with people who are power-mad psychopaths who also suffer from crippling insecurity. It would never occur to them. They would never even allow themselves to consider that the bad end result might have any sort of causal relationship with the idiotic policies that they advance and support and impose. In other words, our policies can't be bad because there are policies. It's a type of political psychosis that reminds me of late-period Richard Nixon, really, when he explained to David Frost that when the president does a thing, it is legal by virtue of the fact that the president did it. It's one of those wonderful intellectual feedback loops whereby people who have erred grievously can sleep like babies at night, secure in the knowledge that all they've ever done has been correct and morally righteous because they were the ones doing it. If we lived in a sane world, a world of circumspection and self-awareness, the people who run our public institutions might say, you know, these inflation numbers really aren't looking good. And they're pretty clearly being driven by spending and regulatory habits that's all been of our own making. So if we want the inflation to go away, we would probably do well to start doing the opposite of the things we've been doing that have caused the inflation in the first place. But alas, we don't live in a world like that. We don't even live in a world that is adjacent to a world like that. We live in a world of dull, unexceptional, simpleton prima donnas who have accidentally blundered their way into political power and or media stardom, who are also burdened with pathological levels of unwarranted self-importance, and who also have a trait they share in common with Heath Ledger's Joker, where they enjoy nothing more than setting the world on fire just so they can watch it burn, and they don't even understand why. And frankly, I will defy anyone to say I'm overstating that last point, because seriously, look me in my eye and tell me there's no element of cruelty and sadism in the continued masking of children in schools, when there continues to exist not a single scrap of data to suggest that any public health goal is being advanced by any such policy. This is, I'm going to abuse your child right in front of you because I damn well can, so fuck you. And think long and hard before the next time you come down to the school board meeting complaining about us transing the kids and assigning hardcore gay porn novels for English class, Mom and Dad. Because we can make that kid's life a hell of a lot more miserable than we already have if you all want to start getting uppity and making a bunch of noise about how parents should have a say in the contents of local public school curricula. You should really stop being such a bunch of hetero, cis-normative white supremacists And don't think I won't call the FBI on your ass either. Hit the music, Jim Eagle. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where you're welcome to stop by any time for a flagon of mead and a nice turkey leg. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And since we're already on the subject of dull, unexceptional, ridiculous people who somehow inexplicably occupy high political office, our friend Crying Adam Kinzinger is in the news, and amazingly, in a remarkable deviation from his normal body of work. It is for reasons that have nothing to do with him slandering Donald Trump or blubbering like a little bitch with a skin knee and shit. Now, Crying Adam went on The View yesterday, and you remember The View. It's the program where a black woman named Goldberg got sent home for 2 weeks because she said Hitler wasn't a racist. And obviously, when your aim is to share your sobering assessment of the immediate dark future of the nation, to state your belief that a full-blown civil war may very well be imminent, well, what show do you go on? Whom do you tell? Well, Joy Behar and The View, of course. Now, as a tribute to this man's idiocy, in recognition of his hero-level douche-bagitude, I want to read out a couple of these quotes. I haven't actually seen the video, but presumably he was saying all this in between fits of uncontrollable weeping, because he is, after all, Crying Adam Kinzinger. And when your name is Crying Adam, when your whole public image is built around being that one Republican who hates Trump and cries all the time, your fans expect their apocalyptic doom-mongering to be accompanied by heaping helpings of emotional hysterics. Quote, and this one is in response to a question about just how perilously close we are to a shooting civil war breaking out. Quote, I think we have to recognize that possibility. In the past, I've said, oh, we don't want to talk about it because, I don't want to make it likely. Let's look at where we are. A civil war isn't what was in the 19th century. It's not state against state, blue against gray. It's going to be armed groups against armed groups, targeted assassination, violence. That's what a 21st and 20th century civil war is. And, end quote. You have to marvel, don't you, at what an exceedingly modest man Crying Adam is. This man loves his country so much. He realizes what a crucially important figure he is in national politics. He recognizes the massive levels of influence that he wields through the untold millions of people in the Adam Kinzinger brigades. That up until now, he's tried to refrain from talking about the possibility of a second war between the states because so important is Adam Kinzinger. Such are the weight of this man's words that just by talking about civil war, just by saying the words, he makes the event more likely to come to pass. And my God, what it must be like to live with that burden. But just as Jesus had his cross to bear, so too does Crying Adam Kinzinger. In fact, such is this man's reputation and influence among the citizenry, it may not be overstating matters to say he could be the only individual who is held in such high esteem by the people that the impending infusion of blood, the rending asunder of the fabric of the nation, might be forestalled or avoided by the oratorical feats of this, our greatest statesman, speaking to Joy Behar on The View. But let's continue with the quotes, shall we? Because if there's one thing I can never get enough of, it is the sweet, sweet nectar of Adam Kinzinger's intellect. Quote, I don't think we have to say, we're identified now by our race, by our ethnic group. We're separating ourselves, and we live in different realities. I don't think it's too far of a bridge to think that's a possibility. I think we have to warn and talk about it so that we can recognize that and fight hard against it and put our country over our parties because our survival actually matters. End quote. And you have to bear in mind, these lofty words, they carry even more weight, even more world-shaking importance when they're being delivered by a man who is an active and gleeful participant in the political headhunting expedition, also known as the January 6th Committee, which again is not lawfully constituted under the rules of the House, whose only real purpose is to damage Donald Trump's prospects for retaking the presidency in 2024. And if we're being honest, shouldn't that task be finished already? What was the point of the 2 fake impeachments if you still need a fake January 6th committee? Will somebody answer me that? But it's not just this blubbering buffoon who seems weirdly desirous of a war breaking out. Foreign war, civil war, I don't care, damn it, just give me a war. So it comes as no surprise that in addition to being a cheerleader for a civil war, Mr. Kinzinger is also an enthusiastic supporter of the war that Joe Biden so desperately wants to fight with Russia over Ukraine. If it was up to this guy and Liz Cheney, I think we'd probably have war with Russia and civil war at the same time. It's a matter of quasi-religious orthodoxy within the uniparty deep state that Russia is 100% bad and evil, and Vladimir Putin is a mustache-twirling movie villain who just wants to invade innocent countries for fun. And we should fight a war with him because, come on, man, what was the point of the Cold War if we can't even get a real war out of it? But I watched a fascinating documentary last weekend, which I was surprised I hadn't seen or even heard of before. It's called The Putin Interviews. It's Putin talking to Oliver Stone. There's 4 solid hours of it. The interviews took place between the middle of 2015 and early 2017, so Trump has just become the president when the final interview happens. Now, we know full well that the industry we used to call the news media is little more now than a clearinghouse for lies and deceit and misinformation, to use the fashionable parlance of the day. For a lot of us, and I count myself in this group, we spent a lot of years thinking, yeah, sure, the news media, they obviously have a bent toward the left. They obviously favor the Democrats over the Republicans, but they're not actually bad actors, are they? They wouldn't just willfully lie for the sake of lying, right? But then Trump became the Republican nominee in 2016, and the mask came down completely, just as a different kind of masks were going up. And we were disabused of that notion, and we realized we'd been giving these people entirely too much credit, far too much trust, for far too long. The news media stopped pretending to have any concern for professional ethics, and in so doing, in that moment, they became the fake news media, and Trump was absolutely 100% correct in calling them that, because somebody needed to say it. We needed somebody to rip off the Band-Aid and disabuse us of whatever modicum of good faith and honest intentions we were still willing to impute to the people we used to call journalists. But Trump in 2016... in that case, when they dropped all pretense of objectivity and began openly cheerleading for his opponent to win the election, that wasn't the moment our news became fake. That was just the moment when we all realized it. So it's worth wondering, if they're willing to lie with such reckless abandon today, what else have they been lying about all along? And I became even more convinced after I watched these interviews that Vladimir Putin is probably at or near the top of that list. For over 20 years, it's been repeated like a mantra throughout the media establishment and the political establishment alike. Putin is a thug. Putin's a killer. Putin's a monster. He's the most odious character imaginable. He probably eats children for dinner. But does he come off like that when you've listened to the guy explain himself for over 4 hours? He sure doesn't to me. For one thing, you can tell this guy is orders of magnitude smarter and more perceptive than anybody in our professional political class is. Our leaders, they are not serious people. Many of our leaders are little more than cartoon characters. Putin is a serious guy, and you can tell he's a serious guy because he gives thoughtful, detailed answers to each question he's asked. And when he finishes, it's often difficult not to empathize with his point of view. As one example, one which is all too depressingly relevant today. For the last 8 or 9 years, the standard U.S. establishment-approved narrative regarding Crimea has been that Vladimir Putin, being the mustache-twirling movie villain he is, just decided one day it would be fun to forcefully annex Crimea, which is rightfully part of Ukrainian territory. And the last part of that is just self-evident mewling nonsense, because historically, Crimea has been either Russian or self-governing for vastly longer than it was ever part of Ukraine. For God's sake, Sevastopol was the home port of the Russian Black Sea Fleet for around 250 years. But as to the first part of that standard narrative, the one that says Russia stole Crimea from Ukraine just because Putin thought it would be fun, the situation sounds rather starkly different in character when you hear Putin's own explanation, wherein he explains that, no, we didn't just decide to go in and invade their ass one day. Crimea held a referendum on whether to remain with Ukraine or go with Russia, and Russia won, resoundingly. Moreover, the Ukrainian constitution gave Crimea the right to hold a binding referendum on whether to remain part of the country. To hear Putin tell it, the only reason armed conflict broke out was because the Ukrainians did not abide by the terms of their own constitution, and they tried to keep Crimea by force when its people had chosen to leave. And of course, the standard rejoinder is simply to hand wave away the referendum and say, well, yeah, obviously Putin rigged the election. But one can't help noticing that seems to be a recurrent theme among members of the U.S. media political establishment who don't wish to accept the validity of election results they don't care for. And Oliver Stone actually does ask him a follow-up question about that. He says something along the lines of, well, there are many in my country who don't accept the legitimacy of Russian elections because you, Vladimir Putin, won't allow international observers in to observe and certify them. And Putin says, and I'm supposed to be proving what to whom if I do that? Do Russia's elections become manifestly more democratic and legitimate if we bring in an American and a Frenchman and an Englishman to give us their stamp of approval? What matters to me is whether the Russian people view the elections as legitimate, because I am the leader of this country, and my top job is to do right by my own people. And it's really quite funny, I think, when the president of Russia, a former KGB station chief, has a better understanding of how democracy works and what the core responsibilities are of democratically elected leaders than the current president of the United States does. But I guess that's the world we live in now. There was another passage in one of the interviews that I found really instructive, that I think a lot of Americans would do well to listen to and consider, because it provides a fuller understanding of just how complicated the situation is between Russia and its contiguous neighbors that were former fellow constituent parts of the Soviet Union, your Belarus and your Georgia and your Ukraine and so on. But up until the last week of December 1991, the 16 countries that we know today were all co-equal parts of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, not unlike the way in which our 50 states comprised the United States. And that had been the status quo all the way since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So for 74 years, you had lots of Russians who started living outside Russia for one reason or another, whether they got sent to a different republic for a job or they wanted to relocate and the government gave them permission. And a lot of those people stayed in their new location and they put down roots. They started families. They did the things that people do. But then, all of a sudden, on Christmas week in 1991, the one country fractures into 16. And just like that, there are millions of Russians who yesterday were living in their own country with all the benefits of citizenship. I mean, insofar as being a Soviet citizen can be viewed as a benefit. But I digress. But when the clock struck midnight, they became foreigners living abroad. And Putin says, and it's difficult to take issue with him, I think, that when that happened, Russia assumed the same responsibilities that all countries owe to their citizens who are living or traveling abroad. So what he views as trying to look out for the welfare of his citizens who are living in foreign country, our news media and our political class have chosen to view that as Russia brazenly interfering in the internal affairs of its neighboring countries. And look, a status quo that takes 74 years to build, it doesn't get swept away in 30 years, not without forced migrations and death marches and all that fun stuff. It will remain true for an extremely long time that in Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, etc., these places will have large populations of people who are either Russian citizens or who identify as Russian. No military or diplomatic intervention by the United States or by NATO or by anybody is going to change that. It is an extremely complicated political calculus, and it will remain so long after all of us have been committed to the soil. And I will state again my firm and intractable belief that any Western intervention in matters between former Soviet republics is a fool's errand that will never produce any favorable result. And that is where we will leave it for this week. Thank you very much, as always, for your kind attention. I hope your weekend is both delightful and edifying. I will see you Monday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.